We're keen to hear from anybody, and it doesn't have to be a good story, although we prefer them, but it could just be any story. It could just be learnings about how you're using Azure. When we get closer to December, we normally do an unconvention night, which is where we get a whole bunch of people to get involved and talk about the Azure.
There we go. The presentations. Yep. There we go.
Nice. Cool. All right. So, Dan.
Rather than white. Yes. So if you're looking for a new adventure and you've got skills in Azure or in cloud, actually, even if you're MuleSoft or Boomi and integration, we definitely are very interested in hearing from you. So please reach out to me or send a message in the meetup group, or you can scan that QR code and reach out to Danica directly. For that, we've got some great clients and great opportunities in there. So,
nice. Thanks, Dan. All right, cool. So just a few updates. So a few things happened in Azure Firewall. We've got a few things that just went GA and a few things that have gone into preview. Definitely worth checking out. So Azure Firewall is getting a lot better. Just not going to read all that. So this is one of the things that I find really important for Azure Firewall is like starting to get that centralized view of what's going on in Azure across your whole tenancy. That's a really great feature, and that's why I'm calling this one out. It's gone GA, so I did mention it a couple of months ago. But starting to get that visibility of firewall of your front doors and your mental blank. App Gateway, the one I don't use. So use the PAS one. It's great. A few VMs that have gone. So these are graphical VMs. So they've got NVIDIA graphics cards built into these VMs. So high performance. The new set of VMs for you to look at. I love space. So even though this is not really a feature you can use, this is kind of like a good news story about how Azure bringing in satellite management has been able to extend the life of a couple of weather satellites for the US government. That's a really good news story. And it's a, what is it? It's a satellite mission management as a service or something. Ground station as a service. So smart tiering to Vault Archive. So this is a limited preview. It's not necessarily, you won't necessarily see it, but some customers are able to access this now. So it's a bit of a snapshot as to what's coming. Hopefully, looks pretty cool. So you can actually tier that stuff into your Vault storage for lower costs. That's pretty cool. They're the big call outs that I saw last month. There's always a lot of stuff moving, but that's what I saw. If you want to follow our user group, so we've got the Slack team. This will be on YouTube. We need a couple of days to get it up there. It's not tonight. A couple of places that you can go that are pretty cool. On-demand training, and these are the blogs that I follow. So they're always worth to have a look. So the Azure blog's really good, and then the Scots do a great talk, and I talk about great stuff. Cool. So that was really quick, but without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bernie. So Bernie's going to help us out with Bicep and some testing.
Great.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Bernie.
Awesome.
Yeah, so as we just sort of said, my name is Bernie White. So I'm a customer engineer from Microsoft.
And yeah, we're going to go through a few things tonight around Bicep, infrastructure code and testing. So hopefully there's be some new things to sort of see. And as always, really just jump in and ask questions, right, as we go through. So pretty well without any further ado, let's jump across. And let's see what screen we've got shared. Let's try showing a slightly different screen. That might be slightly better. Awesome. Alrighty, so yeah, we're going to go through a few different things. We'll go through Bicep, go through the Bicep linter, and sort of how that works. If you are not familiar with it, as a just as an overview, then talk through some well-architected framework at a very high level. I'm not going to bore you with it for sure. And then we're going to go through some tooling options that then we have and that you may or may not be familiar with. Cool. So Azure Bicep, think of this as a new way to write Azure code, right? And so you've probably heard about it. It's been around for a little while now. It's rapidly changing the Azure space. And there's a whole bunch of things that people are doing now with Bicep that they could never really do with ARM templates. If you've never touched Bicep, think of this like a different way to write the ARM templates, similar to Terraform. So if you've ever touched Terraform, it has the sort of the same feel. It has obviously the benefits of Azure though. So there's a lot of things like plugging in key vaults that's super simple, just like you would expect in an ARM template, but better. Also, like calling other resource providers again, super simple, straightforward, just a nicer way to write the same thing. It also combines some things like pulling in text files or JSON files, which you couldn't really do at all with ARM templates. And you can sort of do those types of things with tools like Terraform. And it's sort of every month, it's on a monthly release cadence, and every month it's getting better. They also have a monthly community call. So if you're interested in that, you can go to the Bicep repo under GitHub/Azure/Bicep, and they normally have a discussion there each month for the community call. So you can actually get involved in that as well if you'd like, right? So the repo's there. In terms of installing the tool, you can install this through your AZ CLI with AZ Bicep install and upgrade for getting the latest version. Cool. So, to deploy something like a virtual network, again, this is what it looks like. It provides simpler syntax. It supports a bunch of things. We'll sort of go through a little bit more detail. But one of the key things is it allows you to deploy a virtual network via the resource provider via an API version, which again is similar to the old, ARM template type process. But then it allows you to then again extend on some of the things that were in ARM templates, but in a much simpler way. And we'll sort of see that as we go through. Also, the other thing is that the IntelliSense is way better than ARM templates. So from an authoring perspective, it's just easier, right? It's faster, it's easier. And from a statistical perspective, the Bicep team know that customers that use Bicep are more successful than customers that use ARM templates because they know which deployments are going that are built from ARM templates and ones that are deployed from Bicep, and they've tracked it, right? So they know they're going in the right direction. So much easier authoring experience. Modularity is another great concept as well. So before, when we had ARM templates, we pretty well had an ARM template, and there was this master parent or master child type relationship. We could string together ARM templates, but it was quite cumbersome. You need to have storage accounts, you need to be able to reference things together. Now with Bicep, you actually can just reference them as a module, as a line, and when it runs a compile process, it basically just draws it all into one file and then sends that to Azure. So it sort of simplifies the whole process and it allows you to have modularity very easily. Cool, and the cool thing as well is because it actually acts as a translation process similar to TypeScript and JavaScript. Because it actually compiles to an ARM template, it actually has all the same benefits as well. So you can actually just draw in ARM templates just in Bicep code as well, and it will use those as well. So pretty well, if you've got ARM templates, you don't need to throw them away. You can actually just consume them easier with Bicep. And potentially redevelop if you want, right? Cool, so this is the high level. We've got the Bicep language, which sits over basically ARM templates. And then on the back plane, really, it just talks to the Azure Resource Manager the same way as it previously. Excuse me. So when we talk about the well-architected framework, this is a set of documentation which covers 5 pillars within Azure that we can use for, excuse me, that we can use for building well-architected systems. And so one of those pillars is called the operational excellence pillar. And that pillar covers things like how can you build code, or how can you build systems in an automated way to reduce things like misconfiguration or changes to configuration or configuration drift. So largely it focuses heavily on DevOps and also things like release testing and unit testing. So pretty well, as a recommendation, we should be building testing within our infrastructure as code process. So whenever we build infrastructure, we should also be testing it. Same as what we did with an application code. So, you know, it's been a long time between when people have questioned, should we test application code? That's pretty well been a given for the last 20 years or so, right? And now we're moving to a state where people are realizing, well, actually, we should be doing the same thing with infrastructure as code. And, you know, people have been thinking about this for a while, but there hasn't really been super great tools or a way to approach it. So it just became one of those too hard basket type things whereby, well, you could go ahead and invest, you know, weeks, months, years to build it out, but who's going to make the first move to do that, right? So that's, I guess, where we're going here. Excuse me. So one of the primary goals of moving to this release process is to make it easier for us to move into production. So when we adopt things like DevOps practices, then we're trying to typically get faster deployment of code. We obviously, because we're trying to get speed of deployment and also baking that process, we want to also have additional testing so that when we reach an environment, we can be sure that, well, like all testing, it's never 100%, but have higher confidence that we're going to be successful, or we're going to deploy correctly, or we're going to deploy something that then doesn't need to be wound back later because there was some sort of security issue in the process, right? So reduce the friction, make it faster, be more successful. So this is, I guess, the context for PS Rule for Azure. So PS Rule for Azure is a tool. It's based around PowerShell, but you don't really need to know anything about PowerShell to actually use it. And it combines tests and documentation into a package for Azure Infrastructure as Code. And so that means both ARM templates and Bicep. It's well architected aligned. So it's basically looking at rules against the 5 pillars: so security, performance, efficiency, cost management or cost optimization, operational excellence, and security, if I didn't already mention that one. It comes with over 270 pre-built tests. And it plugs into DevOps. So the tools that you generally expect, like GitHub Actions and Azure Pipelines from a Microsoft perspective, there. However, you can absolutely go ahead and plug into any CI/CD tool, really. So it runs in containers. I've had customers run it in Jenkins, just on a Linux node. So there's lots of different options, right? But in terms of pre-built support and documentation, then basically that's it. So yeah, so PS rules for Azure is cross-platform. Obviously, that means it runs on Mac, Windows, Linux, and it's based on PowerShell Core or PowerShell 7. So it runs across obviously all those platforms. And effectively, all we need is the ability to run a PowerShell container. Excuse me.
Water. It's just water.
That'd be great. And so, like I said, there's a whole bunch of pre-built rules. You know, one of the things is also when we go ahead and obviously continually add rules as well, right? So it's got monthly release cadence. It also has quarterly baselines, which I'll explain what that means in a little while. Thank you. Cool. And then so, and then when we go ahead and look at the documentation as well, really the next thing is what are the next steps you need to do to write better code, right? So it also provides many suggestions about moving forward with code. Here's some code samples of how we actually and then integrate those recommendations. Native tooling. So like we sort of said, we also go ahead and integrate in with VS Code. So again, most people, particularly when they're writing Bicep code, they're going to be using Visual Studio Code. So from that perspective, PS Rule also has integration within Visual Studio Code. And we'll sort of go through like all the options around how you can actually go and customize it yourself. So the 270 pre-built rules is really just to get you started, right? Like we sort of said, one of the hardest things in testing is to get to the point whereby actually I have something that I can take to my team that sort of says, okay, well, let's start testing now, right? And here's some stuff we can start testing with. But over time, we might want to add and improve those tests and make them even more specific to our environment if we want. But at least we can start off with the well-architected framework as a starting point, right? So that's the general idea and the general concept. Cool. So this is sort of how it looks from a GitHub Actions perspective. So when we obviously go ahead and run it, then we will get obviously recommendations on the output, such as have you enabled soft delete on storage accounts? Those types of things. We will again see that in more detail. And then really what we're trying to do here again is to increase success on Azure. Also, when we talk about policies as well, so a lot of organizations will have cloud adoption framework policies in place that will restrict their environment within Azure. Again, we also want to pull that information in as well. So we're working on something in that, and I'll give you a bit of an insight into what's happening there. We obviously want to pair that with meaningful guidance. And then obviously one of the key things we want to do is we want to start enforcing peer reviews fairly straight away, with then the ability to then sort of see what the output is and how we can actually further improve our code. Cool. So let's jump in. Share our screen.
Hey, Bernie, can I ask a quick question while you're switching there?
Yeah, go for it.
How does PS Rule, I imagine you've heard of the ARM TTK, which was like a child, like a grandfather to this.
Yeah.
How does this relate to the TTK, and should people move from the template testing toolkit to this?
Yeah, look, I mean,
Or are they just competitors?
the ARM TTK, so I guess at the moment, they don't have necessarily, they do have some overlap,
Yep.
They're not strictly the same.
Yep.
There is ongoing work to converge.
Yep.
So over time, so I guess there's no specific suggestion to change now.
Yep.
But at the moment, the ARM TTK handles mostly linting around templates, less about well-architected framework. It doesn't really cover anything in terms of the well-architected framework.
Yep.
It mostly covers about, have you built your ARM templates correctly? Such as, have you tried to put passwords in the output field of a template and then things like that. So it does a lot of good things. Some of those things are already within the Bicep linter.
Yep.
Some of those things won't probably make it to the Bicep linter. They may, maybe not. It depends what the community wants. But a lot of the other things, though, will end up in PS rule. Yeah. Fantastic. Let's see what we're going to do there. Maybe we'll just move it over to the screen. That might be slightly easier, and then change the sharing. Cool. So let's have a quick look at Bicep to start off with. So I've got a sample repo here. I'll sort of show you where to get it if you'd like to also do it yourself at some point. I'm actually running in a code space, GitHub code space as well. So again, I'll sort of show you how to set that up if you would like to after the session. So this is our Bicep code. Again, you can sort of see a few things here. One, you can actually do comments, right, as opposed to ARM templates. So that's a big benefit as well. Obviously, it gives you a lot of different options in terms of laying out your code and things like that. You'll also see a few other different things in play as well. So some familiar parameters in terms of using resource group location. So you can do that similar to what you could do with an ARM template. There's also description attributes on top, which is then also similar to the metadata description that you would have found on an ARM template, similar sort of thing. We can then sort of see that we're then referencing code. So in this case here, pretty common that most customers want to go ahead and have different modules for different things. So if I want to deploy a virtual machine within an enterprise environment, I probably want to deploy a virtual machine like that, probably at least more than one time, probably a whole bunch of times, right? Because a lot of customers deploy quite a lot of virtual machines. Similar with other services as well. If you deploy a storage account, you might want to have all the standard lockdowns on the storage account once in a module and then reference it multiple times. So basically, this is what's happening here. There's a few different ways to do it. This is just using a relative path, as you can sort of see. So we'll actually go to the directory where it is. But you can also go ahead and actually pull it from a container registry as well, which is sort of like a distribution point for these modules, effectively, which are in their own right, their own template, right? If I go to this directory here, which is where my relative path is pointing to, I can see I've got a storage module and I have a version 1 of our storage module, and it's effectively just pointing to this main file, right? Which is actually my my storage account template, which obviously goes and builds out storage account, as well as it's got things like my blob storage, my file services configured and things like that. In terms of navigation, I've got a few options. I can actually just control click on there and it will actually go straight to it, which is also nice and convenient, which you can do with almost everything in Bicep. It's fairly syntax ready, so it's fast to move around if you need to as well. Cool. You can sort of see that there's actually not really much in terms of linting that's occurring here in terms of Bicep. If I do things like, I don't know, make a incorrect function name, it's going to obviously do your red squiggle. So it knows instantly, and you can sort of see how quick was that. Very, very quick. It picks it up nicely. Also, in terms of completion, if I go ahead and do that, again, it sort of knows exactly what the properties are really quickly. So again, you can sort of see that from an authoring perspective, that makes it much easier to use. The other thing as well is that over here, when I'm referencing this module all the way down over here, which should in equivalence be similar to a master child ARM template, normally you'd have no IntelliSense at all. You'd have to work it all out yourself, and hopefully you got the right parameters in the right fields. Otherwise, it wouldn't work for you, right? Here we can actually do control space, and it'll actually automatically identify what are the available parameters about, on that other module. So you can sort of see here the skew. I had a description on my parameter, so it knew what it was. It also, in this case here, it was also an allowed set. So it knows specifically here are the two options that are available to me as well, right? So let's go ahead and make this LRS. We'll sort of see what effect that causes later. In terms of other linting that might be occurring, there's quite a few different things that then you may get in terms of linting. So definitely, if you try and put secrets in the out, Bicep will detect that. It'll also go and detect everything like that you would normally expect in terms of extra variables, extra parameters that aren't being used. It will identify those and sort of tell you, hey, do you really need them? There'll only be warnings by default. There is also a configuration file that you can optionally configure within Bicep. So if you go ahead and create a new file called bicep config.json, this will actually go ahead and have a number of different options on there. And in this case here, we then go ahead and look at our analyzers. And our analyzers are effectively our linting rules that then we can go ahead and toggle. So all of these have default values, but we can go ahead and toggle them based on our requirements. So you can sort of see here, there's also things like maximum number of outputs or parameters. There's quite a few different things, and this list is changing on a regular basis with each new release of Bicep. You know, no hard-coded literals and stuff like that. So if you go ahead and put in Azure like addresses, so if you went ahead and put, even though it doesn't fit in that field, but if you put in something like you know, abc.azurewebsites.net, you may or may not like that. I did spell it correctly. Let's try keyvault.net, I think, instead. Maybe not. So in most cases, it will then detect those host names. There's a set of reserved host names that then are allowed, and some of them are not. And basically in that list, if you detect one of those things, the linter should complain about those things, right? For the most part. In terms of things related to the well-architected framework, again, the linter is not really being designed that way or intended that way. There is a way that you can build your own copy of the Bicep linter and then implement your own rules if you want, but that's a bit of a long-winded process, and nobody's really done this on scale or anything like that at this point, right? So the intent is that probably at the moment, the lint is probably not going to be extensible, although possibly the Bicep team may do that in the future. Who knows? It's definitely not on their version 1 roadmap to sort of meet. So that sort of leaves us with the situation of, okay, well, you know, this Bicep support is great, but we really need to start enforcing some enterprise rules, right? So if we just close that one. Cool, let's go ahead and run PS rule. So PS rule pretty well just has a config file here. So a YAML file, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Apart from that, within VS Code, I do have an extension added. So there is a extension called PS rule. And this extension calls PowerShell. So on my machine, if I was running locally, then I would just go ahead and install the PowerShell modules as required. In this case here, though, I'm running the code space, and the code space, which if you want to use it, will actually just install those things anyway. So I actually need to do nothing. Also, when I'm running from GitHub Actions or Azure Pipelines, it's all pre-installed. So again, you need to do nothing. So it's really about the scenario when I want to test locally. and I don't want to use a code space, then that's the scenario where I'll need to install a PowerShell module beforehand. Or Mac on Mac Windows Linux, right? So let's go ahead and do run, terminal run, and run analysis. So that task effectively comes from the extension, but it's also listed in the VS Code tasks here. So basically get that kicked off. And so we've got a few things that it's found, or at least one thing that it's found. And this was the change that I made before. So this is the type of output that you can expect. It ran, it did this thing. Hey, wait a sec, this storage account doesn't have GRS enabled. It's got LRS enabled. So maybe you want to change that, right? This is a fairly specific one. And there's a lot of cases where you don't want GRS. So that's something that I'll sort of show you how to actually go ahead and suppress or override that. But it's a good example, right? Because again, there's a lot of common cases like that. Let's take a few more things, which again are going to be a little bit more security related, which are going to be, clear ones you probably want to turn off, right? So an example like allow blob public access. It's false. That's a good setting to have. Let's make it true, right? So we allow public access, right? Let's also go down to our storage account and, well, we don't really need TLS 1.2. Maybe let's just try one of the other options like TLS 1, right?
Sorry, just checking if
And let's go ahead and rerun our task and see what changes. So I changed a few things in a few different places. Once I actually changed it in the deployment file up here, right? But then I also referenced it in the module that I was referencing, right, as well. And it found all of those, right? So it found one through used replication, the blob public access, which up here in our deployment file, there's actually no storage account here. It's actually really, this is a parameter for the module that we're using, which will then configure a storage account at some point. So obviously it detected that. Obviously it detected our storage SKU option, but then also all the way down here, right? And so basically what's happening in the background here is it's getting that information, it's compiling the template, and then basically parsing that template, and then taking the position of, if I deployed this to Azure, what would it look like? And so it's worked out, obviously, from that, once it's fully deployed, that it would then resolve all the parameters, it would resolve any variables that might exist or anything like that. And then the final thing that would be deployed would be a storage account that had LRS with TLS 1 and public blob access, right? So it's then combined that all together and then sort of said, okay, well, here are all the issues that we need to address, right? Cool. Any questions on that one?
a little bit, I'm not too sure with regards to the scope of the rule set. So is this require any access to your subscriptions as a reader role, in the sense of you've got a policy where storage can only be provisioned in onshore data centers, things of that nature? Is it able to pick up on that as rule set, or do you have to have a one-to-one parallel to actually explicitly write that in to match your policy?
Yeah, so the question around, does it have access to your subscription? No, we haven't checked our Azure subscription at all, right? Which is also a great thing because it means that we didn't actually need to connect to it. We didn't need actually any credentials at all. It actually evaluated the rule set. The rule set is local. It's in that PowerShell module that we talked about. So from that perspective, it just did it. You could see it was pretty quick as well, right? Typically, if you connect to an Azure subscription, it'll take a little bit longer, right? And it will go a little bit longer. So I guess to the question around, did it work out that you only allow deployments to Australia Southeast or Australia East? No, but we can build a rule for that, right? Or in the future, which is something that we're working on, we can just export our policy and then it would just detect it as local rules, right? Yeah. Question.
What level is this work? Is it working on the Bicep itself, or is it working on the ARM or some as industry or something else?
It's working on the ARM template, but it's automatically compiling the Bicep file. So you don't need to really think about it, you just write your Bicep code. It then just does that on the back end. It basically goes and does the compile and then runs the analysis. And this allows, the reason why we do it that way is so that then we can use the same rules for any ARM templates that currently exist, and we can use the same rules for Bicep code. So for you, it makes no difference. You just run the rules and you write the code that you choose, and away you go. Yeah. Cool. So that's the, I guess, the general concept and where I guess we're going with this, and I guess what an example of how it might work. So obviously with these rules, we might want to know about, well, how can we actually go ahead and improve our code, right? So you can sort of see down here, there is various different links. This will jump out to documentation. And so most of the documentation is pretty good, but there's always some gaps. But what you can generally expect is, and let me go ahead and put this over here. You can expect something like this, which is going to give you some sort of description, some sort of recommendation, and here's some examples. So if we're going to write in an ARM template, this is what we'd write to meet the requirements, whereas in Bicep, this is what we'd write, right? So really like practical, we want to make obviously writing Bicep code or ARM templates really easy and so available to everybody. So as soon as we sort of know that we've got an issue, we can then go ahead and check out the documentation and then move from there in terms of, okay, well, how do we make the code better, right? Because we want to have that fast iteration cycle, catch as many issues as we need to, write new code, and then deploy it out. And ideally, we haven't actually even deployed any resources yet. So ideally, before we even get to our dev environment, maybe we're already sorted, right? Maybe we even, obviously, well before we get to production. Last thing we want is to roll something out to, prod and then go, oh yeah, guys, we actually need to roll that one back because, it had this setting that, security have pinged us on now before we do our scan, before we go live on this app. So, we can't release now, or we need to go ahead and pull it back and refactor, right? Because obviously from a DevOps perspective, that's the most expensive thing is if we put it through all our environments, we didn't catch an issue, and now we get pinged at the last moment. And now we've got to go ahead and make some changes, right? And then push it through our environments again. Cool. In terms of like repositories, I'll throw some up at the end as well. But so there's a few different repositories. So the main one that I'll take you to is this one here. So this is the sample code that I'm using tonight. There's a few additional things in here which I'll sort of point out, but for the most part, this is actually copied from this GitHub template. This also includes the GitHub Codespaces environment as well. So you can basically pretty well clone this and pretty well get exactly started of where we're going tonight, right? Cool. So we've got our code, we've got our failures. Let's obviously go ahead and make a few changes and correct a few things. So in terms of TLS, 2, we really do want TLS 2, it turns out. In terms of the other things, skew, let's change this one back to false, right? Skew, this is actually a dev environment, so it's a dev storage account. We actually don't want GRS, right? Because GRS, typically speaking, more copies, more cost. So for our dev environment, we decided, LRS is perfectly fine for us, right? So now we actually want to go through the process of suppressing and configuring the environment a little bit more. I'll come back to that, but let's just jump through a few things first in terms of what the basic repo setup is, right? So we've got our PS rule config. So this is basically just an options file. It includes a bunch of different options. It tells us how PS rule can get started. Again, there's some links here. And again, this is actually just pretty well exactly came from that repo. So there's a few things in here, but you can absolutely just go ahead and copy that repo yourself. But basically, it's sort of saying, go ahead and use PS rule for Azure and use at least the minimum version, right? So 1.17.1 is the latest version, but it will obviously just use whatever version's available, as long as the version that's installed is at least this version. Otherwise, it will sort of complain, hey, you need to get a new version, right? And you set this. It'll go ahead and automatically pull in the module. So again, this makes it easier. We don't really need to call any command lines or anything like that. It just knows what to do. There's also like different languages potentially as well. So if you had a specific language requirement, then you can do that there. We want to exclude a certain set of files. So let me explain this because this one's slightly trickier, right? So when we, to sort of make this happen, in this case here, I had a deployment file. So this sort of represents if I was deploying to Azure. In this case here, this is my landing zone subscription for my RG app 002, right? So this would be an example of me actually deploying it to Azure if I actually push this through my pipeline. Further down, I also have each of my modules has a test file in it, right? And so this is sort of like similar sort of thing, but a test scenario. It allows us to test our code in various different ways by basically providing different parameters to our module, right? So what we want to do is effectively test our storage module, but the issue that we have is that how can we have context of what is actually going to be deployed to Azure if we don't know what the mandatory parameters are, right? So what do we know what name's going to be called? In this case here, there's a lot of optional parameters, but there might be some that are required. In this case here, name's the only one required. Let's have a look at Key Vault because it might be slightly different, right? Again, this is probably name. Yeah, so name's the only required one in this particular case here. But of the various different configurations, obviously, if you're testing something you're providing via parameter, then you obviously need to have a way to provide that as an option so that then you can actually test for it, right? Because the purpose is to test what would happen if we deployed this to Azure. So effectively, I've created a test file, which is nothing special. It's just another Bicep file. So it's just a Bicep file that I've called main.test.bicep, which then it's just by convention. But then what that allows me to do within my options file is effectively don't analyze the main Bicep file, analyze the test file. So I exclude the main file and then I include the test files. And so the reason why I do that is because if I am not answering the basic questions of here are the mandatory parameters, I don't want to scan that file because I can't fully analyze the context if those mandatory parameters aren't met, right? So that's basically what's happening here. Exclude my main, include my tests, and then I can go ahead and test from there. Obviously, as well, anything that's outside, like in my deployments file, will also get tested as well because it's not explicitly excluded anywhere, right? I've also got a few additional options here, such as expand parameter files and Bicep files. And basically, that's the concept that we're talking about here is we're getting the Bicep files, we're expanding them to be what they would be deployed like in Azure, and then we're performing analysis on it, right? In terms of Bicep, it also has an additional switch here or parameter, which allows me to set the timeout. So depending on how big my Bicep files are, also if I'm pulling stuff back from a Bicep registry, it may take a certain amount of time. The default time is 5 seconds, which is generally good for local development. But if you have complexities, you may need to bump this up. So in this repo, in this sample repo, I've got it bumped up to 10. I have pushed it up to 15 or 30. Especially if it's a long chain of Bicep modules. But you can obviously go ahead and play with this setting as you want. You can set it up to 120 seconds, and that's a per Bicep file restore. So if it's taking 120 seconds, then there's something wrong. There's also a suppression option here, which we'll sort of talk about more in a sec. But basically, that's our configuration. And theoretically, we don't really need many of these options here. Really, our main option that we need is this option here, and basically our exclude options, and then basically enable our Bicep expansion. In this case here, I actually also have templates in my repository as well. So I'm actually testing both simultaneously without really even calling it out. I'm actually testing ARM templates with parameter files as well as Bicep. And so I can sort of see that briefly by the fact that I have tested, 131 rules across that, right, and only 4 files. Okay. Cool. So when we sort of then start to talk a little bit more broadly, particularly in an enterprise environment, so PS rule generally drops rules once a month. It so happens that most enterprises probably can't adjust their infrastructure's code on a monthly basis. Normally they take a little bit longer than that, particularly if they've already got a standard pattern that they've rolled out, and maybe there's a new rule that adds a new thing. They may not necessarily want to, update the infrastructure code on a monthly basis. So this is where baselines comes in, right? So the idea is that we push out a quarterly baseline. This has the rules from the last quarter in there, and then the enterprises then choose which baseline they want to use. So they pick the next quarterly baseline, right? And then they might go ahead and run that for 3 months. The next quarterly baseline might come out, and then they have then a decision point when they can go, okay, well, the new quarterly baseline's out. Should we go ahead and move? We might go ahead and run it with the newest quarterly baseline, see what's happening, see what's breaking. If there's nothing breaking, we'll just do it, right? If there is something breaking, then we might need a little bit more time to readjust our code, or maybe we need to disable some rules that aren't applicable for our organization, right? So yeah, pretty well, greater consistency, incremental adoption is really what the baselines provide. And so they provide pretty well a set of rules, which obviously is changing on a quarterly basis. But then also, they might also have additional configuration options, like the current version of AKS or something like that, as an example. So they combine both of those things. There's some standard ones that obviously we're shipping out every quarter, but you can actually build your own baselines too, right? So you could also choose to then sort of say, well, I don't want that one. Let's go ahead and build our own baseline, and then we'll just use that, and we'll update that as we need to. So that's also an option that you have too. Handling exceptions. So again, you're going to probably have this case whereby we need to start suppressing certain cases, right? In this case here, again, something that we talked about, we'll see it a little bit more in detail, but you may want to suppress things like, okay, well, we decided that we don't actually need GRS for dev, so we want to disable or suppress it, right? So you've got a few different options. You can disable the rule entirely. So if you don't really care about the GRS replication rule at all, just turn it off, right? If you don't want it anywhere in your environment, you can do that, right? The other thing you could do is you could then override certain instances. So you could sort of say, well, for this specific instance, we don't want that rule, but for everything else we do, right? The third option that you've got is suppression group, which is a little bit more of a intelligent rule where we actually go ahead and set a condition that sort of says, when it meets this condition, that's when we want to suppress, right? So in this case here, the example of if our storage account is going to be deployed to our dev environment, maybe we've got an env tag that says it's in the dev environment. So if you see that, don't ignore this rule, right? Don't care about this rule. So that's basically how it works. It'll also go ahead and sort of show what's in the synopsis there as well in the output to sort of say this was the reason for it, right? This is the reason why it was suppressed in the first place. Cool. The other thing to talk through is reporting. So there's a few different options there. So one of the native formats that's supported is Serif, which is an industry standard. It's a reasonably newer industry standard, so not everything supports it yet. But things like the GitHub Advanced Security does. There's also support for it in Azure Devops as well. So there's probably more tools that we're going to come out to support it over time, but effectively this is just a JSON file format anyway, so effectively you can ingest it to anything anyway, if you want to. It also, PS rule does also support JSON, Markdown. It also supports NUnit as well. So there's probably quite a few different variations of if I want to get reports on the output, what I can use, right? The other option that we have is we can actually ingest the logs straight into Azure Monitor as well. So via a log analytics workspace, we can pull the logs in, and then we can then do whatever we'd like to do with it once it's there. So we could go ahead and export it out. We could go ahead and trigger alerts on it. We could also pull it into Power BI or run a workbook across it or query it, right? So we've got quite a fair bit of flexibility once it's there as well. Cool, so let's have a little bit more of a look around our suppression and also how do we go about building a custom rule. Cool, so I mentioned our PS rule .yaml file. So down the bottom, it basically has the suppression section. So suppression key, and basically the way it works is that we have the name of the rule, and then we have whatever the resource is going to be called. So again, this is all based on what was it going to be called when it was deployed to Azure. So obviously it knows what that is, right? So you can then identify those things as well here. So pretty well, you've got a few examples there, but if we all wanted to go ahead and suppress the one that I had over here, which was going to be called this, right? I could go ahead and add a new entry for the rule, which is Azure storage. And then I think it was GRS. Let's go ahead and have a look. Use replication. So that's basically it there. And add an entry for it. And if we want to add a second one, I'd obviously just do that. And that's just basically an array, right? So I can go ahead and add in visual options. So that's our one of our options. If we decided that we didn't want this rule at all entirely, and we just wanted to disable it, right? Because the well-architected framework obviously is a set of architecture recommendations, but it's not necessarily 100% right for all customers or 100% of the time, right? There's going to be cases whereby, you know, maybe you should have public IP addresses because in the subscription of your connectivity subscription, that is your gateway to the internet, right? So in that case there, you want a public IP address, but in other cases you don't. So we could also go ahead and exclude it entirely. So if we go to there's a section which we can go ahead and type, and we'll go ahead and add a rule and then exclude. And then we could just also put the name of the rule there, and that would entirely disable the rule. So that's, you know, our third option, suppression, exclusion, and then our suppression group, right? And so this one, how this one works is there's a few ways you could approach this, but a default folder that PS rule automatically knows about is the .ps-rule folder. So we can sort of see that one up here. It's got some stuff in it already, but we can go ahead and either we can add to the existing file or we can go ahead and add a new file. We're going to add a new file just to sort of see how easy that is and how it works. But effectively, we can put multiple things in the same file and organize it however we like, right? So let's go ahead and have a dev env.rule.yaml, right? So the requirement here is it must be .rule.yaml. You can also do PS1 for PowerShell or JSON for JSON. So you've got a few different options about how you do it. In the case of the suppression group, it's supported in JSON or YAML. So pretty well pick your poison. But in this case here, I'm going to use YAML. So if I type in suppression, I get some IntelliSense. Again, this comes from the extension we've got installed. So it's fairly straightforward. Let's go ahead and choose suppression group YAML. And then we're going to call it our dev storage. And we can just leave it at that. We don't really need to be any more complicated, but you can go ahead and add it, change it to be whatever you like. Then we go ahead and give us a synopsis. And again, the synopsis comes in the output. So obviously it'll be part of our logs, right? So we want to give it a reason of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So we're going to say we're going to suppress DRS for dev storage to reduce cost. Cool. We're going to then specify the rule that we're going to exclude. Again, this is also an array, so you could actually have more than one, right? In this case here, we've sort of said that this is our suppression group around dev storage, but we could obviously make it more generic or less generic as you need to, right? Cool. And then we've got an if block, right? So this is our condition on when should we suppress. So in this case here, we can go ahead and control space. Again, there's a whole bunch of different conditions and things like that that we can use. So we're going to use the field property, which basically sort of says in the object that we're analyzing, go ahead and find a property that we're interested in. In this case here, the env, or sorry, the tags.env is appropriate because if we go back to our storage account, we have tag set and we've got our env as being dev, right? So that's basically our property. And then we've got a few different options. Again, we could do equals, right? So if we just had a simple, okay, if it's dev, then suppress it, fairly straightforward. We could also go ahead and do in, which obviously then would give us an array of here are all the environments that we don't care about, right? We could also go ahead and do, again, a little bit different than policy, but we can also do things like match if we want to do a regular expression, or not match as well. There is also things like your like condition as well, right? So you can put wildcards and stuff like in there. So quite a few different options. In terms of the full list of expressions, if we go ahead and jump to help and look at expressions. So at the moment, this is sort of, scroll down slightly there. This is the current list of expressions. So not everything, but common things that you're probably going to want most of the time, particularly in the context of what we've got, right? Cool. So we're just going to do in, because again, there's a fairly common thing. You might want to have UAT, you might want to have UAT, you might want to have dev, right? So let's go with that. And let's see what happens. So at the moment we corrected 2, right? Because they were mistakes. They were user mistakes that we decided, let's not fight the security team over that. Let's just fix our code. And then this one here, let's go ahead and add a suppression in there, which obviously, again, this is going to be checked into our source controls. So from that perspective, it's going to go through our peer review process. Our team is going to go, hey, Bernie, why'd you put the suppression in? And then we'll go have a look at the synopsis because we've already given a good reason there. And they go, yep, oh, sorry, we didn't check that. Let's go ahead and approve it. And then our pull request will be approved, right? So let's go ahead and run our test again. And hopefully we should have less issues than what we currently have. Cool. And so you can sort of see there, there's a few things that happened. We sort of saw our suppression. So our first 2 suppressions here, these are actually coming from, these were there originally, but they're coming from our options file, which was down, suppression down the bottom here. Right. And then the new ones are here. So you'll sort of see it actually did more than what we expected. It actually targeted additional results, which was a key vault. So we could actually go ahead and refine this a little bit more. In this specific case, it's not really going to cause an issue, apart from the fact that it's in our logs that we suppressed this thing that we didn't really mean to, right? So from that perspective, let's refine it a little bit more. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to do an all of, right? All of. And then we're basically going to sort of say, well, all these conditions need to be true. just indent that in. And then we'll also say that it also needs to be a type of storage account. So, in this case here, there's actually a special property for it called type, which then is always just dot, which is the current object. And then that would be equal to storage account. So it would be Microsoft dot storage / storage accounts. By default, it's going to be case sensitive, case insensitive. You can go ahead and like change case sensitive as well, but by default, it sort of takes PowerShell's default notion of be in case insensitive by default, and then specify when you want to be case sensitive. So yeah, you don't necessarily need to add any case there. Let's go ahead and rerun. Cool, and then we're all good. So we're only targeting the right storage account, which is fantastic, and we've got a reason as to why we did that. So from an audit perspective, that is much more awesome. So if we extend on that, so now we're doing it locally. That's fantastic. Obviously, the Bicep linter by default is going to work locally as well anyway, right? But really what we want to do is we want to make this a requirement for pull requests when we go ahead and merge a code in. So when our team goes ahead and merge a code, we want to make sure that at least it passes these checks first, or we have an appropriate suppression in place which explains why we didn't do this thing, right? So with our GitHub, again, that sample repo that I pointed out, it has a GitHub action workflow pre-built for you. But basically, it looks like this. So basically, call the action and then run the specific module. So PS rule for Azure, which is psrule.rules.azure. Similar for the Azure pipelines, and that's the bit that is currently not in the repo at the moment. So let me just go ahead and pull that down. This is what wasn't in this the sample repo yet, but then there's also pipelines as well. So for Azure pipelines, so for Azure pipelines, it looks like this. I have a few additional things in here, but for the most part, this top part here that I've selected is all we need to get started. And then you can sort of see there's some options here around the output format using Serif, and I've also got the workspace linked up as well, which I'll sort of show you in a sec. Let's go ahead and just check this code in though, because we want to sort of see some results in our CI process. So added storage suppression. And GRS. Cool, so we'll add that and we'll add our change here, which is just our updated storage LRS. Cool, let's sync our file. And then we should be able to jump across to our repo. Cool. So I've got my my repo here. Again, that was just generated from the quick start with a few additions. And then let's go ahead and create our pull request to merge it into main, like we do. Cool. And so obviously our action is going to kick off in a sec here. And so what I really want to do is add this as a protected, like a branch protection. So I don't have that currently set up here in my private free GitHub repository, but that's obviously what we want to do in an enterprise environment. So for GitHub, we'll basically set up a protected branch. And in Azure Devops, that's a branch policy, but are basically the same thing. I'll sort of show you that as well, but basically that's what we want to do. And this will make this a requirement that we can't actually push this button until the tests pass. And if the tests don't pass, then we can't press the button, we can't merge the code. If we get everything good, then we can, or once peer reviews have occurred as well, depending on what your policy requirements are. So in this case here, let's go to settings and see where we set that. So normally we go to branches and we go ahead and create a branch protection rule. And then we'd sort of say, we want to protect main. And then we require status checks before merging. And we'd probably say we might want some peer reviews as well. I'm not going to enable that for this case. And then we'll run analyze Azure resources. And we make that a requirement of, I think it's analyze repository is actually what we want, I think. It should be for GitHub Actions. Yeah. Cool. And then create. Cool. This is just basically sort of saying, hey, I'm running a free private repo, so you can't do this thing. So, but that's how we normally do it, right? Cool. So our code's good. We've run our checks. Both our checks passed. Let's go ahead and have a look at the output again. What do we expect from a GitHub Actions perspective? And so it's almost the same, but then we basically have this task within GitHub Actions, which again is basically going to provide us sort of similar sort of output as what we're looking for. In this case here, it's actually including a verbose output by default, because again, within our pipeline, it sort of makes sense to have that additional output, whereas when we're running VS Code, because the window is so small and the default limit is 5,000 lines, it's very quick to actually run out of console scroll room. So that's why it's a reduced format by default, but you can actually change that in your settings. You can sort of see here all the things that it was detecting, but again, we just didn't sort of see because of the default view, right? If we go to Azure Devops, let's also have a look over there. Cool. And if we jump in, we will also see that there. So again, similar experience between both, right? You may notice that there's these warnings here. So it's basically sort of saying, and you can sort of see it on this main page as well. So there's some warnings in here by default. You can disable them, and most customers do, right? But I guess the default process is to let you know that it didn't process something, right, by default. To let you know that if you expected it to, then it didn't, right? So what we can do is, again, amend our pull request quite easily to disable that, to get rid of those warnings if we don't care about them or we're not interested in them. So we can go ahead and add an exception, execution option, and then we can turn off not processed warning to be false. Right, and we don't need these other things anyway. We'll just do that, and away we go. Cool, so we'll let that run. Let's jump across though to build a custom rule, right? So we've got our suppression, fairly straightforward. So what do we do about custom rules? Because again, like the gentleman down the front here mentioned before, we may want to go ahead and implement rules for our environment, right? And so the well-architected framework obviously covers things like best security practice and things like that, but it's not environment specific, right? It's not going to know that, hey, you're an Australian customer and I only want to deploy in Australia, so make sure that that's the case, right? So to do something like that, we can absolutely do that. Again, similar process. We actually have, again, some either JSON, PowerShell, or YAML that we can use. So if we want to do a YAML-based rule, so let's just do locations.rule.yaml in a separate file, although we could keep it together. And let's again just go ahead and type rule, and we can do a rule with a selector, a rule with a type. So a selector is similar to the expression we used for our suppression group to determine was it the dev environment. Again, we can use that as a generic thing that we can plug into a bunch of different rules if we want. We'll just leave that like that, and we'll just use the selector, but we'll just comment it out for now. So maybe we want to make sure that we want to target anything and make sure it's only Australia East. Again, that's a pretty common one, especially for the audience. So deploy to allowed locations. Cool. So what we want to do is then set, well, what is the good location that we want, right? So we want to then go ahead and check the field of location. We want that to be in, I mean, let's be generous. Let's do Australia East and maybe Australia Southeast as well, right? Right, so it needs to be one of those two things. Cool. And then so because we may have, in this case here, we're really only talking about Azure, but we could have other things in our repo that we're scanning as well. So PS rule could actually pick up other files and other configurations. So we specifically only want to tell it where we care about an Azure resource that actually can be put in a location, right? Which is the same thing as what's taggable. So there is a number of pre-built selectors that we can use. So I'm going to use one that is quite convenient to use. So let me show you where we get that from. So from our Azure PS rule for Azure documentation, if we go to reference, we can actually go ahead and see all our rules there. But let's go to selectors, and we're just going to use supports tag, which is effectively also the location ones for the most part. So that's a nice easy fix. And then I'm going to give it a name as such as only deploy into, you know, corp allowed locations, right? Cool. And then obviously I'm absolutely going to try and deploy in another location, of course, because what wouldn't be a rule if we didn't actually test it? So let's go up to our location and let's just hard code this up here as a parameter. Let's change this to East US, right? Okay. Cool. Let's check locally. Cool. We don't have an error, which is unexpected. So let's see what the issue is. It was probably my selector. And it is actually my selector. Yeah. So that selector actually needs to be fully qualified. So this rule. Let's try that. Cool. And we have a bunch of resources now, obviously, that are failing. Anybody guess why?
They're all built in East US. No?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things is that I actually went and changed a parameter, right? And that parameter affects more than one thing, right? So all the things that then now rely on that parameter now fail, right? Because again, we're not caring about what did I have down here. We don't care that this was something, right? We care that the original parameter that fed from and what would deploy to Azure is going to be bad, right? So that's sort of, again, the thought process again, right? Cool. So that's a rule in YAML. very extremely similar for JSON because you use the same schema. It's just JSON-ish. If we want to go ahead and look at it, what does it look from a PowerShell perspective? Some people might prefer PowerShell. So locations, let's just do .rule.ps1. Cool. And we go ahead and do use a rule keyword. So this works sort of like a block. So we go ahead and basically create a block, and then within the block we put our tests. So in this case here, let's go ahead and do allowed locations as the name. Cool. And then we can go ahead and do with, similar to what we did in our YAML over here, and then we'll just go ahead and copy that. Cool. And then we go ahead and basically we just need to do open curly brackets. There is a parameter called body, which is what it actually relates to. Body. And then within our PowerShell, then we put our test code, whatever that is. We can, strictly speaking, just use PowerShell. So if you know PowerShell, you know how to build rules, right? So we could go ahead and do, so there's a few built-in variables that help you out. So target object is one of those built-in variables, which is, this is the object that we're currently analyzing. And we could then go .location because we know that that object is going to have a location property. And then we could go if it's not equal to, Australia East, then that would be fine, right? And again, we could do an and or in this particular case and do the same thing. So that would be perfectly fine. In fact, we'll do that. Again, similarly, we can also go ahead and add a synopsis comment. And then this will then display in the output as the reason for our rule. So only require Australia East. Go ahead and run that. Cool. So we've got obviously multiple failures now occurring. Deploy to allowed locations. So this should be allowed locations is not equal to Australia East. That should be it's equal. We want to do equals, of course. Equals.
So
That's my bad.
the outcome of that is a true.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So the great question and great answer or statement there. So the idea here is that if it's successful, we want it to return true, right? So if it's a good thing, then it's going to return true. If it's a bad thing, then it will return false, right? And that's really all PS rule on the base level is really looking for. There's some additional things that we can do, which I'll show you in a sec, to then again make it even better. But effectively, if it's true, then it's going to pass, right? If there's multiple trues and falses, then they all need to be trues, right? So if there's one thing that fails, then it will be a problem. If it returns no results, so maybe you had like an if condition and then you didn't return a true or false at the end, it'll come back with an inconclusive fail. So it'll basically say you didn't pass a failed, so we're going to assume it's failed, but it'll come back with a custom reason of the fact that it was inconclusive, right? So you can sort of see our allowed locations there as well. You can sort of see our synopsis in our YAML, and this was our synopsis in our PowerShell, again, just coming on the output, right? You can sort of see that this one in our YAML, though, does give us a little bit more of an explanation as to what actually occurred as opposed to just the PowerShell that I wrote. So what I can do instead is there's a number of built-in helpers that I can use, which again allow us to then expand on that. But if I just want to write basic PowerShell, I can just do that. But I can also take advantage of some assert, an assert object that then has a whole bunch of additional options, which again look like the expressions that we were just talking about before, right? So I can then go ahead and do in, similar to what I could before, and I can feed in my target object, and then I can go ahead and say I want to look at the location property, and then I want it to be in Australia East or Australia South. Whoops. East, right?
The first one I think is wrong too.
Yes, yes, thank you. Cool. And then close my curly bracket, and away I go. Cool. So, I mean, hopefully this should give us the result we're expecting, but you can sort of see that, hey, we can write rules in a couple of different ways, right? If I'm PowerShell guru or my team just loves PowerShell, then go nuts with PowerShell. If I don't want to touch PowerShell because maybe I'm good at PowerShell, but some of my team don't really care for PowerShell, then we can just go YAML, right? So in terms of parity, there's a lot of stuff that's got parity. There is a few things that are not available currently in YAML as today. So there is an advanced configuration object that you can use. So you can go ahead and actually pull in configuration from that PS rule YAML file. You can't do that in YAML today, but we're working on it, right? So over time, you will see more and more parity. If you want to do some basic rules, you can easily do those in YAML. If you want to do some advanced cases, then PowerShell at the moment, but in the future, there'll be other options there as well. Cool. Let's just double check we got most of the, I guess, key points. Yeah, the one thing that I wanted to show you as well was just a quick look at Azure Monitor as well. So I've actually got the data obviously going into log analytics as well. So let's have a bit of a look. So if you pretty well just use the default options, which are then explained within the setup under setup Azure Monitor logs, right? Then the logs will go into a default log, which is basically just use the custom logs within log analytics. So that is outside my scroll area, but
Maybe you could just search.
yeah, good idea. Good idea. PS rule CL. So custom logs just have a CL added. If you've ever done custom logs before, I guess the traps are when you go ahead and ingest new custom logs, it'll take about 15 minutes. You'll go, where's my custom logs? And then you'll be hitting refresh like 20 times. And then, a few seconds later, it will appear. So be aware that obviously the first time you do it, it'll create the table. And it takes a little bit of time for that to appear. So if it doesn't appear straight away, if you've got no errors on the command line, it's probably good. Just give it a little bit longer. And then if we go ahead and run that, we can then start to query it. Right, so we've got a bunch of data around, here's the pillar and a whole bunch of stuff in the logs. Maybe I'll just get some common columns, or I'll just pull out some of the stuff that we had before, like right. So we've got like the repository, the pillar that the rule failed on, and passes and files and things like that. So there's a fair bit of data in there. You can pull it out. Again, you can go nuts with, creating custom rules, exports. In my case, I've got a workbook that I did up. Which then sort of gives me, for my repositories over time, pass files, any errors occurring. But obviously, once the log's there, you can sort of pretty well go nuts with whatever you like. Cool. So let's jump back across. Cool. So if you're interested in this project and you want to start using it, then definitely check out the repos. I've got some additional resource links as well to sort of get started. But you can basically go ahead and find that in GitHub under the Microsoft and Azure repos. And before we sort of, I guess, finish up, does anybody have any questions, or is there anything that you'd like to sort of see that then might be relevant to you?
Bernie, any questions I had, I wrote them down as I thought of them, and you answered every single one. But I did want to ask about, have you seen anyone doing naming conventions with this, like trying to enforce where, you know, things should have a specific name?
Yeah, good question. It's a great question. So, you know, can you do names with this, or have I seen people do it, right? So there is a project that then specifically a little bit, I've got another project which is under GitHub /microsoft/psrules.rules.caf. So this project is similar to PSRule for Azure, but it's PSRule for CAF, right? It's nowhere near as far evolved as what you've sort of seen tonight. But again, it basically uses the same rules engine, the same approach. So basically everything else is the same apart from you pull in a different module. So instead of pulling PSRule.rules.azure, you pull in PSRule.rules.caf. And you can actually go ahead and run both of them together as well. So that's the idea. So in terms of naming conventions, this has some examples. So it has a number of different resources for naming, and basically it just sort of takes the CAF approach in terms of that it uses a prefix, right? But obviously you could definitely go ahead and like build your own on this, and or you know this will evolve over time as well. In terms of one of the there's some interesting things that are coming out of another open source project that then they're sort of building a tool that allows you to have a web interface to define your naming standard. You've seen that one? Yeah. So I've been talking to that team, so we may look at actually just pulling that information into rules at some point, but that's probably like way off in the future at this point, but that's probably where we'd like to go with it, I would sort of say. But yeah, for the moment, this would probably be your starting point, and you can definitely go ahead and build rules. Is there anything pre-built apart from this? Not that I'm aware of. Yeah,
that's good. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and the policy testing is actually the other big one. Like if we could analyze the policies before we hit the Azure subscription, that would be so much better.
Yeah, absolutely.
You should have an admin that's saying, oh, we can open up Canberra now or something like that, and then all vice versa.
Exactly.
And you're not informed.
Yeah,
You've got to write
when you run it, it doesn't actually work.
That's why your rules in the policy, and you got to write it here.
Exactly. So yeah, so being able to, I guess, sync with policy. So again, it's actually under this repo. So under PSRule for Azure, there is a discussion on policy support experimental. So definitely check that out. So basically there's some command lines that are experimental at the moment that allow you to do that. There's a fair few limitations at this point. There's a lot of policies that it doesn't work for, but there's a number of policies that it does work for. So basically the idea here is basically run the command line. It actually generates your rules. So then it just becomes a CI/CD process whereby you run a daily that basically just exports the rules out, right? So that's the general concept. But yeah, we've still got a little way to go, but we should sort of see what happens over the next few months.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool, great questions. Anybody else?
Stop recording.
No, so then pretty well, I guess here are the links for the recording. So feel free to check these out. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to present to you guys. So yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, hopefully you find this project helpful.
Thanks, Nick.